Good morning and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war as the crisis continues. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up on the program today, the Israeli military says it killed Hamas commander of Houthi battalion with airstrike in Gaza. Hamas official in Lebanon says there are no safe areas in Gaza. Plus, Yemen's Houthis claim attacks on 2 Israeli ships in the Red Sea. Thank you so much for joining us. We begin with news coming out of the Israeli military, which says it had killed a Hamas commander of the Houthi battalion with an airstrike in Gaza. The Israeli army wasted no time to release this video, it said, to show the strike that killed the Hamas commander. According to the army spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, the Hamas commander, who was named in a statement as Haitam Kouajari, directed militants to carry out raids into southern Israel on October the 7th, in which 1,200 people were killed and more than 200 taken hostage. Mr. Hagari says that Kouajari also led battles in the Houthi area of Gaza in the past month. Meanwhile, Israeli forces say they've found 800 shafts leading to Hamas' vast subterranean network of tunnels and bunkers since the Gaza ground operation began on October the 7th. The Israeli army released video, it says, shows soldiers finding and destroying the tunnel shafts and said many in civilian areas such as schools, mosques, kindergartens, and playgrounds. However, the locations or dates when the videos were recorded could not be independently verified. Earlier, Hamas said that it had hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, a network comparable in size to the New York subway system, to protect and serve as operational basis for the terror organization. In the meantime, Israeli ground forces are pushing into southern Gaza as the area becomes the focus of its operations. Israeli Chief of General Staff Herzi Halevi says Israel's operation in southern Gaza will match its earlier offensive against Hamas in the northern part of the Palestinian enclave. Israeli forces bombed wide areas of the Gaza Strip on Sunday, and it ended with a number of Palestinians killed and wounded as civilians in the besieged territory sought shelter in an ever-shrinking area of the south. The Hamas terrorist group spokesman said its fighters clashed with Israeli troops about 2 kilometers from the southern city of Khan Yunis. Residents, many of whom had moved there to flee earlier attacks, say they could hear tank fire and feared a new Israeli ground offensive was building. The Israeli military ordered people to evacuate some areas in and around the city. A Lebanon-based Hamas official, Osama Hamdan, says that there are no safe areas in the Gaza Strip. He says that Israel had lied about there being safe zones in the south of the enclave as part of a plan to trap the Palestinians, according to him, with the intention of killing civilians. Mr. Hamdan called on Belgium and Spain to build on their bold and correct positions and lead a European international movement to visit Gaza to witness the plight of the people. The Belgian Prime Minister says he's spoken with Israel's president following the resumption of fighting in Gaza and told him there could be no more killing of civilians. On the other hand, Spain's Prime Minister spoke with Israel's War Cabinet member, Benny Gantz, to try to diffuse tension between the warring parties. Yemen's Houthi movement, allies of Hamas in Gaza, say that its navy had attacked 2 Israeli ships, Unity Explorer and Number 9, with an armed drone and a naval missile. Spokesperson for the group's military says the 2 ships were targeted in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait between Yemen and Eritrea after they rejected warnings without elaborating. Spokesman says the attacks were in response to the demands of the Yemeni people and will continue until Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip had ended. An Israel-linked cargo ship was seized last month by the Houthis, allies of Iran. The group, which controls most of Yemen's Red Sea coast, had previously fired ballistic missiles and armed drones at Israel and vowed to target more Israeli vessels. There's been no comment from Israel regarding the claim. Now let's talk to the President Emeritus Corporate Council on Africa, also a former president, the American Center for International Leadership, and the president of Cohen & Woods International, Mr. Stephen Hayes, who joins us from the United States. Mr. Hayes, good morning, and thank you for being with us today.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. The escalation of the conflict involving the Houthis in Yemen with their attacks on Israel and U.S. Navy carriers, which has resulted in the latest reports saying that F-35s from the Israeli Air Force have retaliated with attacks in Yemen with the help of information and guidance from the Americans. Can you elaborate on your position on how the United States is helping its ally Israel in their attacks against Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the war in Gaza?
Well, quite frankly, I cannot elaborate on that because I don't have access to that information. Obviously, it would require help from our own intelligence services as to where the attacks are coming from and so forth. But other than that, I'm really not, to be quite honest with you, I'm not able or qualified to comment on that.
Could you then comment on the U.S. foreign policy position in Israel concerning its defense against Gaza, against the Hamas terrorists and the group and all its enemies in that regard? We've seen Secretary of State Anthony Blinken back in the Middle East to continue to look for ways to minimize or even eliminate the civilian deaths caused by Israel in Palestine and bring an end to the crisis.
Strangely, I think, you remember that a few weeks ago when this started, I felt that U.S. influence was very, very weak on all sides, and there was probably going to be needed to be another interlocutor. Qatar has stepped up to some extent, but I think that the war, strangely, has strengthened the U.S. influence in the Middle East. If its influence is weak anywhere right now, it's still questionable as how much it can influence Israeli policy. But it certainly, I think, played a very positive role behind the scenes, particularly with the Arab nations, to keep this war from expanding. And I think that it's becoming, as it speaks more strongly on the situation in Gaza and the attack on civilians as well, is becoming a stronger and more moderating force. Is it seen as neutral? Of course not. It is an ally of Israel, has always been an ally of Israel, and so that's simply not going to change. But can it affect Israeli policy? Can it bring this war to a close? There are, like it or not, there are not many other nations that could do that right now. So I think the U.S. role has become stronger. I wouldn't say that it's an all-powerful force by any means. It still has to work with a very difficult prime minister in Israel, but it also has kept the channels of communication open, and again, thanks to the Qataris.
Before I have you comment on why you call the prime minister in Israel a difficult prime minister, is the genie in the bottle Iran because of its proxy influence on Lebanon and the Hezbollah and the Houthis, and the claims that they are the ones who are sending all these weapons, they are the ones who are arming Hamas, that the genie is out of the bottle and U.S. sanctions are not firm enough to rein in Iran from its influence in the region?
I think what has been a surprise to many is the massive amount of weapons that Hamas does have. And of course, it had to come from primarily Iran or its allies, such as Russia. The amount of arms that Hamas has stored up, I think, is amazing. It is a full. It has been able to conduct a full war. It is continuing to conduct that. And certainly Iran has played a very, very important role in this war, whether they deny it or not. In fact, they've denied that this wasn't their decision. Well, maybe it wasn't their decision, but they've certainly supported it. They've certainly made it possible. A lot of this, I think, lays at the foot of Iran and the Iranian leaders.
We have reports that 90% of the weapons that Hamas has is because of Iran. There are also unconfirmed reports that some of the aid diverted to Palestine over the years was taken by Hamas and diverted for use for their military intentions.
Well, I think that's probably true. They've been able to, I think, yeah, I suppose you could have praise for the fact that they've been able to utilize and save weapons that have been accrued over the time from others. I wouldn't really call that praise, but it's interesting that they have saved, and what it also shows that they've been planning an offensive for a very long time. This isn't simply a last year or two, but the tunnel system that apparently exists, the accrual of weapons over the years from no matter what sources they are, says this was a long time in coming, which does come back again to the intelligence failure that failed to anticipate this attack.
Let's stay with foreign policy of the United States. From the days of the red lines of President Barack Obama, which were crossed and were not met with proportionate expected force on the part of the Americans, possibly until the Trump administration, to now, you recall there was a time, there was a policy of speak softly and carry a big stick. I don't recall which of your former presidents touted that policy. It seems now that America is maybe also still speaking softly, but not carrying so big a stick.
Well, I think American policy is changing somewhat. I am not too critical of the Biden administration for its policy to the Middle East. In fact, I think it's finally getting its nerve back up to be more neutral. It's never going to be fully neutral. There's no secret about that. But that policy has becoming a little bit more balanced. But how that's going to be affected by the next election remains to be seen. I think this is very precarious time for Biden for many reasons, but particularly as it applies to the Middle East. American opinion is beginning to shift ever so slightly. I don't think it'll ever shift away from Israel totally, but there's a growing sympathy to the Palestinians, I think partly because of the number of civilian deaths and the way that Netanyahu is handling this. On the other hand, it's hard to see how at this stage he could handle it somewhat differently, but it's a very difficult time in American politics too, as you well know. That's going to affect our policies, perhaps even towards Israel.
Isn't that what is emboldening Iran and the strikes against U.S. targets and U.S. forces in Syria and in other bases in the Middle East?
I think that's interesting too, because the play in the United States, we haven't really seen a lot of news on the attacks on U.S. forces elsewhere. I think that the Biden administration probably deserves a lot of praise for its restraint on that, because they could easily take those to expand the war, and that would, I think, be a disaster. I think that certainly we're not going to tolerate the attacks on American troops and defending, but I think that restraint has been probably the smartest strategy, and I think that Biden deserves praise for the restraint shown on the attacks that have come in not simply in Syria, but in other countries as well, because in the Middle East and on shipping as well, that could have easily provoked at a different time a much stronger response. And I think that it's good that the Republican Party has not tried to split the country on this issue too. The time now is for diplomacy and a lot of restraint to bring this war to a close.
if you call it restraint, further down the road, is there a danger that that restraint may be misinterpreted as weakness or indecision?
I think it will be played as that. I think often restraint is strength. And it comes from wisdom. I don't think it comes as much from a tepid response, but it could be taken to that, but I don't think it will be. And the reason I think it will not be is that there is the ongoing discussions behind the scenes. I think the restraint has also come from the Arab nations so far. They haven't stepped up in strong support other than vocal for the Palestinians. They've stayed back behind the scenes in many ways, and I think I'm not one to overly praise political leaders in our own country. I think you know that, but I think also there has been quite a bit of diplomacy behind the scenes that is added to that. So I think right now, I would say, given all situations right now, the diplomacy behind the scenes is positive. Obviously, it hasn't brought the war to a close yet, but I think that the fact is that there is a great deal going on behind the scenes, and I think that there's got to be a greater solution to this. And I think right now I would have to give the Biden administration more positive marks on how it's handling this situation.
It seemed too good to be true, and it turned out to be so, that the pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas expired after the 7th day, and as we speak, 137 hostages still remain. A number of them are Americans. It's not known of the 40 or so number that are unaccounted for. For the Americans who are being held hostage and the position of the Hamas terrorists who continue to keep them hostage, what is your opinion on how Egypt and Qatar are bringing their influence to bear?
I think it's hard to say, and sometimes it's dangerous to say anything publicly on the hostages. But certainly, I think the hostages supposedly are all male now. I question that, but I think that the American hostages would probably be the least likely to be released at this stage. I think that's a pressure point that Hamas will make. I think right now we have to hope that the American hostages, as well as every other hostage, will not be killed by Hamas. It's a very dangerous time for those hostages. I think the tempers, the anger, the irrationality, it puts their lives in extreme danger. Certainly the bombing hasn't helped, but at the same time, they've been kept alive because they are important to the future and the settlement of this war.
How do you take the information from Hamas that some of the hostages have been killed and they end up being alive, and some said to have been alive are now killed? That in context of the Jerusalem attack at the bus stop that ended with 3 civilian deaths inside Jerusalem, even when the truce or the pause in military fighting was holding. Israel says that that is exactly why Hamas cannot be trusted, and they're not sincere in anything they say concerning this conflict.
Well, it's a strong argument. Hamas did break the truce. It didn't take much to break the truce, though, honestly, as well. And it's difficult, too, to know whether Hamas has total control over all elements. It was an individual at the bus stop, apparently, not a group, that killed the Israeli civilians. So it's difficult to know.
Two individuals.
But Hamas did take credit for that. So Hamas has broken the truce. Can they be trusted? It's difficult to trust Hamas. It's difficult in any situation of war to trust the other side, because both sides are looking for advantage. But is Hamas proving to be trustworthy? No, it's not.
Let's talk about the situation in Gaza now. Israel says that they're expanded their foray to the southern part of Gaza, to Han Yunis, where they claim that some of the leaders of Hamas are embedded. They're trying to extricate them, even while this fighting continues in the north. So they say, Naza, this morning that all areas in Gaza are fair game for fighting, even as they also said that they discovered 200 tunnels which have been neutralized by the Israelis. And as that has happened, we hear that over 200 Palestinians have lost their lives.
Well, I think you're asking the right questions, frankly, and at the bottom of that question, of course, the war is expanding, no doubt about it. And and even further in that question is what happens to Gaza when this war ends. The civilian deaths are going to continue. I would be surprised if it isn't already much heavier than 15,000 that are dead, because a lot of the bodies are still buried in the bombing and so forth. I think the situation now is a total war between Israel and Hamas, which means that every area in Gaza is open for attack. It's not going to be simply limited to the north and having no attack zone or anything like that. I think the whole situation now is going to be the elimination of Hamas as a government. It can be eliminated as a government. I don't think you'll ever eliminate every member of Hamas or its resistance. But the question is then what happens to Gaza afterwards, and I think that's a very big question. The situation, I think Biden is also saying the right thing, that the only solution is a two-state solution. Netanyahu and his allies are very strongly against that. That's very clear. And so it's going to, what happens to Gaza is going to be, I think, critical to the solution of this war. Who's going to administer Gaza afterwards? I can't imagine U.S. troops going in. They would just simply be targets. The Arab nations don't want to send anyone in. The Israelis would be the occupiers, and I think the Israelis will be the occupiers. There's got to be a settlement on a two-state solution.
Your Vice President Kamala Harris says recently that one of those pointers that you've mentioned is that there should be no occupation of Gaza by Israel. But that runs counter to the Israeli position that if they do not have a demilitarized Gaza, then the problem continues to exist and making them an existential threat, that is Hamas, to Israel.
Well, I think de facto there will be an occupation of Gaza. Israel is not simply going to end the war and walk away. They're going to have to administer the state that they've just essentially conquered, assuming that is the result, and that's the most probable result. So to say that we're saying the right things, there should not be an occupation, I think the reality is that there probably will be an occupation. The question is, how long does that occupation last? What is the nature of it? And what is the transition? I don't see UN troops going in, although it might be necessary for that. But it's going to be an occupation one way or another. Again, how long will that last? And what will be the transition? What is the solution? Netanyahu refuses to give authority to the Palestinian Authority, saying it's deep corruption and it's aging leadership, which isn't unique to Palestine, of course. So I think that to say that there will be no occupation is probably an interesting statement, but there will inevitably be some occupation, because there's got to be that, and then there has to be a transition. Now, that transition needs to be defined.
Indeed, we're all getting a very harsh dose of reality and work over the possible outcomes of this war in Gaza. We thank you, Mr. Hayes, for being with us this morning. Mr. Stephen Hayes is a President Emeritus of the Corporate Council on Africa and former president of American Center on International Leadership and president of Cohen & Woods International, joined us from Washington. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, and a privilege as well. Thank you very much.
Still ahead, Deputy Hamas Chief Saleh al-Aruri says no prisoner exchange with Israel until there is ceasefire in Gaza. We'll have that story and more after the break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. We pick up where we left off. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris says too many Palestinians are being killed in Gaza, urging Israel to do more to protect them. Speaking at a news conference on the sidelines of the COP28 summit in Dubai, Mrs. Harris sketched out a U.S. vision for a post-conflict Gaza. She says Israel has a legitimate right to conduct military operations against Hamas, who launched attacks from Gaza on October the 7th.
As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating. It is truly heartbreaking. As Israel pursues its military objectives in Gaza, we believe Israel must do more to protect innocent civilians. So we all want this conflict to end as soon as possible and to ensure Israel's security and ensure security for the Palestinian people. We must accelerate efforts to build an enduring peace, and that begins with planning for what happens the day after the fighting ends. 5 principles guide our approach for post-conflict Gaza. No forcible displacement, no reoccupation, no siege or blockade, no reduction in territory, and no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism. We want to see a unified Gaza and West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority security forces must be strengthened to eventually assume security responsibilities in Gaza. Until then, there must be security arrangements that are acceptable to Israel, the people of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, and the international partners. And to reiterate, and this is very important, terrorists will not be permitted to continue to threaten Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself, and we will remain steadfast in that conviction. We are working with Israel and our partners in the region to secure the release of all the hostages, which includes Americans.
While U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is emphasizing the need for the protection of civilians in Gaza, calling them the center of gravity in Israel's war with Hamas, and warning over the risks of their radicalization. Mr. Austin's remarks comes as Israeli warplanes and artillery bombarded the enclave over the weekend. The United States, which has rushed military assistance to Israel, including air defenses and other munitions, has been increasingly vocal that Israel must narrow the combat zone during any offensive in southern Gaza and ensure safe areas for Palestinians.
You see, in this kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. So I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative. The United States will remain Israel's closest friend in the world. Our support for Israel's security is non-negotiable, and it never will be. And to make it crystal clear that America's commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. And so we have rushed U.S. security assistance to Israel to help it defend its people and its territory, and to help ensure that Hamas can never again commit the atrocities that we saw on October 7th.
Now, Deputy Hamas Chief Saleh al-Aluri says that no more prisoners will be exchanged with Israel until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. Mr. Aluri says the hostages still being held captive by Hamas were Israeli soldiers and civilian men who previously served in the Israeli army. He says they will not be freed until there was a permanent ceasefire. Pope Francis says it was painful to see that the truce between Israel and Hamas had been broken and called on all parties involved to reach a new ceasefire agreement as soon as possible. The pontiff also said he was thinking about the people still held hostage in Gaza and the lack of basic necessities in the Palestinian territory. Pope Francis, who is suffering from a lung inflammation, had his words read by an aide during his Sunday Angelus message, which he delivered indoors from his Vatican residence rather than by a window overlooking St. Peter's Square. Now let's talk to Dr. Humphrey Ojako, former ambassador of Nigeria to Switzerland. Thank you, sir, for making out the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
We've come again to this juncture where it threatens to be a vicious cycle. Hamas say that there will be no ceasefire, as we've just heard from one of the officials, until hostilities end. Israel have said that even though prisoners are exchanged, there will be no pause in fighting as they did before in the last 8 days before the pause in fighting ended. So it seems we've come to a point, another intractable situation.
You know, I would like to recall that the last time we discussed this temporary pauses in the fighting because of the need to resupply Gaza and to release the hostages that Hamas took on the 7th October from Israel, and some of their own prisoners that Israel has been keeping for years. We raised the question, and after those pauses, then what? That is the question. I think that's what's playing out now in the negotiations that's going on in Qatar. Israel has pulled out, as you know. Recall, Israel's war objective is total destruction of Hamas, to eliminate it completely from being a fighting force and a source of challenge or insecurity to Israel. It should no longer be a threat to Israel. And we raise the question, is that really an objective that has the prospect of success? I still do not believe that that is going to be a successful strategic objective. And I am sort of vindicated that the Americans themselves, both the Vice President Kamala Harris and the Secretary of Defense, are now telling Israel directly that, yes, it could win the war, but lose the strategic war in the long run, because Hamas is regarded by Western countries as a terrorist organization. But most of the Arab countries and the rest of the world, as things unfolding, see them as people fighting for the freedom of their people. That is an idea. It cannot be killed. It cannot die. So maybe the main concern for the international community, and of course the United Nations, is virtually out of all of this, because Israel doesn't trust it at all. So it is now the Arab countries of Egypt, Qatar, the United States itself, who are brokering all these conversations and discussions with the entry of some of the powers trying to help. But the world should do better than that. And I think that is where we should be concentrating our attention. The international community should be concentrating our attention on what happens after this war? Is it going to perpetuate as a country, Israel, a country that is perpetually at war with its neighbors? Are the Palestinians going to live in perpetuity in a state of uncertainty? They don't know if they are sovereign or non-sovereign and all of that. I think that is where global attention should focus. What happens? This idea of Israel will take overall security responsibility. I had your last interview with Mr. Hayes making that statement about Israel taking overall security responsibility for the governance of Gaza for some time. Israel itself says it will take overall security of Gaza, take responsibility for everything about that piece of land for an indefinite period of time. I do not think that's going to be a recipe for peace in any time soon. So the question is about this short intervals of fighting or not fighting. We on Israel made it clear that once they are not getting their hostages released, at least at a minimum of 10 a day, they will resume the war, and they were not going to change their war tactics, which, as we all can see, is quite ferocious. The problem being that since they resumed this fight on Saturday, they have now moved to the area they were asking Palestinians to move down to. That's the southern part of Gaza. There's now serious fighting in that place. So what is going to happen?
Well, not only did they say they oversee a demilitarized Gaza for posterity, they say that there must be a proper buffer zone created between the borders of Gaza and Israel so that what happened on October 7 will not happen again. Ambassador, if you were in their shoes, what would you do, given the continuous violent attacks against Israel in times of peace and in times of war, or even in times of a truce, which happened just last week?
You know, the one thing missing in this question is that nagging original question. Do the Palestinians in any way have any reasons, any cause, any justifiable reasons whatsoever to seek to restore some kind of dignity to their own lives, some kind of sovereignty under their own control and all of that? If Israel is the reason the Palestinians cannot have a sovereign homeland of their own, are they justified in any way to try to change the narrative? I think that was the statement the Secretary General of the United Nations made. Palestinian attacks were not being carried out of context. And of course, a lot of people, particularly Israel and its own allies, didn't take too kindly to that statement. And it has made it impossible for the United Nations to coordinate activities that could lead to the question you are now raising. What should Israel do? The question we should ask is, what should the world do? Yes, it becomes the role of the international community to find that buffer force to stand between Israel and the borders of Israel and Gaza Strip. But in finding it, it has to be within the context of a larger political agenda. There has to be a political strategy for a much longer lasting solution to this problem. It cannot be that, yes.
Ambassador, sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador. Are you inferring a two-state solution? Do you think Hamas want a two-state solution? That two-state solution has been pondered over decades now. Do you think Hamas wants to live side by side in peace with Israel?
In fact, that's a very interesting question. And I think you and I have addressed this question once before. The question should be both ways. Does Israel, particularly Israel under President Benjamin Netanyahu and the right-wing, I call it extreme right-wing coalition he now runs, do they want a two-state solution? My own reading says no. Do the Palestinians in general, that is the Fatah group, for instance, do they want a two-state solution? Probably. Hamas is a different equation altogether. I do not believe also that Hamas, which is extreme, along with the Islamic Jihad and the rest of fringe groups that say they are fighting for Palestinian freedom, I do not think they want a two-state solution. So between the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas, there is a common link, and that common link is the unstated rejection of a two-state solution. But that's where international diplomacy and the powers must come in. It is not calling it imposing, but it is coercing, kind of a consensus. Hamas must be made to see that it has no other chance of securing Palestinian security, of the respect and dignity for the Palestinian people, other than through a two-state solution. And Israel should realize that in the long run, ultimately, in the long run, at the end of all of this, it has to have peace. It has to have security. And the only way to have that is to have another responsible state as a neighbor, and not a group of people fighting among themselves, and then the only thing linking them is fighting to destabilize Israel. So it is in the best interest, and that's the responsibility of the global community, to persuade these two fighting antagonists that, listen, the answer to the question of Palestine and Israel lies in the balls of justice. And justice can only be found in a two-state solution. That is my take on this. Who is going to do it? It is still that international community, and that international community should be led by the United Nations, which both sides should be able to trust and work with.
Do you trust the United Nations to have any influence anymore in this conflict?
Can you say that again, please?
Do you trust the United Nations? You say it's the United Nations that should be turned to. Hasn't that ship sailed the harbor? Hasn't that horse left the stable? The United Nations don't have any credibility left with Israel.
It is that credibility thing that is the problem here. But it goes beyond credibility in that for decades, if you recall, for decades, the United Nations have passed all sorts of resolutions on the Arab-Israeli, then Arab-Palestinian conflict that is still raging. And more often than not, Israel has ignored most of all of that. Like now, the entire world is saying, of course, led again by UN agencies, mind you, who are very strongly present in Gaza. And as a last count, they have lost, to the best of my recollection, over 111 UN personnel have lost their lives in Israel. So, I mean, in Gaza. And Israel is not even being considered that if we destroy the fabric that holds the global community together, and that is the United Nations and its agencies, then this will be a thoroughly chaotic place to manage. The world will be. So to restore some dignity to the credibility of the United Nations, credibility of the United Nations is important. I do not believe the UN is being partisan. And probably much of Israel, that is when you don't have extremists, that's extreme right-wing conservative government in power, they do not always see the United Nations as a gang-up against Israel. I do not think so. But whenever the right-wing government is in power, particularly right now, they tend to say that way, which may have prompted the statement the UN Secretary General made, which is being taken as being partisan on the side of the Palestinians. But what is at stake here? Take a look at the number of people who have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. We are talking of over 15,000 people, most of them children and women. How does that hold up for the strategic interest of Israel itself as this conflict goes on? Even if they succeed in destroying Hamas, and this is what the United Nations is saying, you are also creating a fertile ground for the emergence of more Hamasis, for more radicals. The children
Ambassador,
who are... Yeah,
yes.
Please.
Ambassador, thank you. I want to squeeze in a quick question because we've run out of time. If Hamas stops not violent acts and violent encounters and violent attacks against Israel, does that diminish their negotiations on a two-state solution? The whole nexus of this problem is that Israel says that Hamas continuously carries out violent attacks before this war, suicide bombings, all sorts of attacks against innocent civilians, which they continue to do and which led to this war in the first place.
Let me put it this way. Take a look at the fight Black Africa had against apartheid in South Africa. If there was no element, if there was no military wing, military actions against the apartheid government by the current ruling party in South Africa, do you think the Boers, do you think the apartheid regime would have paid any heed to all the noise and talk about freedom and equality and absence of racial discrimination and all of that in South Africa? I do not think so.
On the contrary, Ambassador, I thought that the non-violent position of Nelson Mandela and his incarceration for decades and the subsequent pressure from the international community was the very reason why the apartheid fell, and not any violence.
Well, I can tell you that in fighting is a live situation, a strategic war such as that of freedom. Every asset at the disposal of the oppressed will be used. Israel knows that. That is how Israel itself came to existence in 1948. It didn't just stay and say, please, we want a state of Israel, and they came to be. There was a war, and Israel took territory. In 1967, there was another war, and Israel took more territory.
Well,
those territories weren't originally called Israel. They were.
Indeed. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your time and your insight and your contribution this morning. We appreciate your participation in the program today. Ambassador, that is Dr. Humphrey Ojako, former ambassador to Switzerland, who joined us today. Still to come on the program, pro-Palestinian activists protest at COP28 climate summit in Dubai call for a ceasefire in Gaza. More details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of this morning's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. The first 8 trucks since the collapse of the Gaza truce entered through the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing on Saturday. Video footage released by Palestine Red Crescent Society appeared to show a line of trucks driving from the Egyptian side of the Rafah border According to the Egyptian security, the Red Crescent sources 2 fuel trucks and 58 trucks went through the Egyptian side heading to Arja for inspection. The trucks were said to contain food, water, relief assistance, medicine, and medical supply. Finally today, more than 100 activists called for a ceasefire in Gaza in a protest held during the COP28 UN Climate Summit in the United Arab Emirates. The activists held banners calling for a ceasefire and climate decolonization, while others waved flags featuring a cartoonish watermelon which shares the colors of the Palestinian flag and is a symbol of Palestinian solidarity. Flags that read, "From the river to the sea," were briefly flown, while chants of Free Palestine also broke out. According to the activists, there will be no climate justice without human rights.
First of all, as human beings, we cannot ignore what is happening in Gaza. And this is the first gathering of world leaders since the bombing was escalated last October. And this is an opportunity we cannot afford to pass up, to stand in solidarity with the people and to call for the ceasefire.
We wanted to start the COP28 bringing a very clear message, that there is no climate justice without human rights, that the murder, the occupation of the commons all around the globe is a climate justice issue, because these things are not disconnected.
I mean, a lot of us are, Palestinians, our line is to boycott spaces like this because we can't do business as usual. For anybody to be here while all of us are getting massacred is a difficult thing to digest, but I wanted to make sure as part of this coalition that we at least had some Gazan voices in the space, because we know that there are other voices in the space that are going to greenwash what's happening in Gaza, and so we needed to make sure we had a counter presence that reminded folks that you cannot have climate justice without justice for all people and the lives on the ground that suffer from climate, from war, from violence.
And that's it for this morning's coverage of Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Please stay with Channels Television for all of the news, all of the time. Have a good day.